conversations all the time with farmers and people in the farming community about ways to regenerate our land. And I've been, even before joining MOA, lucky enough to work in that regenerative space in farming. So I actually met Neal about 3 or 4 years ago and had the pleasure of spending a few days with him walking a farm that I was managing. And on that farm, we had livestock, orchard, and vegetable, as well as some nursery tree stock. So in that time, I learned a great deal from him about soil fertility. And I think he's a great wealth of knowledge and how he approaches fertility management. So Neal has been a student of Dr. Albrecht and carries the Albrecht method into his practice. He's with Kinsey Labs out of South Central Missouri?
Southeast.
Southeast Missouri. And he works with farmers across the world in managing soil fertility. And I've heard personally some stories of great success that Neal has shared. So Neal, first of all, I am going to let you introduce yourself, just a little bit about who you are and how you got into the soil fertility, and then give us a quick overview of what the Albrecht method is.
All right. Well, I was born in the same county where I live now, Scott County in Southeast. And my father was a farmer. My two grandfathers were farmers. So I grew up farming and enjoyed farming. But I'm one of 12 children, and my father said, I can't put everybody into farming. You need to go to university and learn to do something else.
That's
I
a
went
good
to the
way to get it.
university to be, and my dad wanted me to become a CPA or an accountant or something. But I enjoyed accounting, but I found out I didn't like being inside. So, and I didn't know that till I got to college and so forth. And I also didn't like living in the city. I liked living in the country. So I decided, I don't know if I want to be an accountant and be pinned up and maybe not even have a window to look out. And so I got interested and started looking into agricultural economics and decided to get a master's degree in food industry logistics, where you move the food around and so forth. Well, uh, long story short, it was a hybrid program at University of Missouri between the School of Business and the Department of Agricultural Economics, and they couldn't agree, so the course got canceled after 1 year it was canceled. So in the meantime, I met Dr. William Albrecht, who was my office was in Mumford Hall, second floor. His office was the first floor of Mumford Hall, and I grew up farming, and one of the questions that I always had was, we lived right on the Mississippi River, old swampland, and we thought we were doing good when we went in and drained that swampland, cleared out the old scrub timber, and planted it in soybeans. And the first year it'd make 50 bushel. The soil test said you didn't need anything, and since all the other land made 30 bushel, everybody believed it. We didn't need anything. But then the second year you plant it in soybeans, because it was heavy ground. Soybeans were the only crop you could make enough money to go ahead and plant. So it was continuous soybeans. And the second year it would make 40 bushels, soil test still said you didn't need anything. Third year it'd make 30 bushels, soil test still said you didn't need anything. And after that it'd make 30 bushel a year. But why didn't it make 40 or 50? This question I asked, and when I was at University of Missouri in Ag Econ, I asked a number of people. Nobody could give an answer. And one agronomy student said, go talk to Dr. William Albrecht. He could, if anybody can tell you, he can tell you. So I made an appointment, went to see Dr. Albrecht and asked him the question. And he said, well, before I give you an answer, let me learn a little bit about you. So I told him how both my grandfathers had been farmers and my father was a farmer. And he said, well, your grandfather, what was his main cash crop? Well, back at that time, when my grandfather was farming, he died when I was 8. But when my grandfather was farming, the biggest cash crop in southeast Missouri was alfalfa. You made more money on alfalfa than you did on any other kind of a crop back then. And I said alfalfa, and he shook his head and he said, well, what happened? I said, well, we every year it floods, you get seep water and so forth, and there would be low spots in the alfalfa field. And my grandfather would drive around and look at the alfalfa, and I always got to ride with him. until my dad was in the army. So my grandfather, I grew up with my grandfather and my mother and grandmother. And as we would drive around, he'd look at those low spots where the seepwater was the last to leave as the river went back down. And when the sour dock and curly dock started coming into the low spots, he'd say, "Well, it's not going to raise good enough alfalfa when this plays out. We'll put soybeans on it because it'll make more money." And Dr. Albrecht shaking his head, "Yes, that's right." And he said, after I finished telling him, he said, "Neal, I know those soils that you're talking about. I worked down there for part on my doctorate and so forth." And he said, "I'm going to tell you, if your grandfather and your father had known what I'm going to tell you now, they would still have alfalfa as their main cash crop." Now, by the time I graduated from high school, my grandfather died when I was 8. Every county in the Boot Hill of Missouri had at least one alfalfa mill. Some had two. By the time I graduated from high school, there was only one left, and it was in Mississippi County. Everybody had quit growing alfalfa because they couldn't make enough money on it. And so that there was only one alfalfa mill left. Now that's when I graduated from high school. This is when I'm going for a master's. I'm talking to Dr. Albrecht, and he says, if your father and your grandfather had known this, alfalfa will still be their main cash crop. And he proceeded to explain why that happened. And you know what? Went home and put it into practice, and it worked. It worked right on our farms, and I could not understand why everybody wasn't doing it. Well, I mean, I understand why, but you would think if somebody could go out there and do that, that everybody say, "Well, what are you doing?" And we want to do that too. But it was counter to all the advice because we had pHs in 7.3 and 7.4. And at 7.3 or 7.4, nobody thought you ought to put limestone on. But we had to come in there and put on a ton to 2 tons of limestone. And when you did that on those high pH soil in 3 years, that soybean yield went from 30 bushels back to 50 and higher. We got some 55 and 60 bushel beans just by putting lime on those high pH soils. This is why so many people uh, don't really understand the Albrecht method. You've got to study as to why you do that. You don't do that on every soil, but our soils, he said, what the problem is, you've got a high pH. And he said, anytime your pH is too high, you have too much of something. And if you have too much of one thing, you don't have enough of something else. You find out what you don't have enough of and supply that. And that's what will straighten out your soil more than anything else you can spend money on. And he said, in your case, I can tell you, do the soil test and see. But he said, you're looking at, well, he asked me, he said, how did your grandfather and father determine fertilizer? I said, well, we did soil tests with University of Missouri. He said, and what was on it? Phosphorus and potassium and pH. And he shook his head, yes. And he said, and do you know why that was the soil test you got? No, because it was free. He said, the university did those tests for free. But he said, you don't need to know what your pH is. He said, it's good to know it, but you need to know what the pH is and what's causing that pH to be low or high. And he said, if it's high, you got to find out what do you have too much of and what do you not have enough of. And he said, in your case, go back and do the samples, but what it's going to show is the calcium in your soils are high in pounds per acre, but they don't have the proper percentage to produce correctly. And as soon as he showed me what to do, and I came back home and we started doing that, it worked. And the next door neighbor did the same thing and it worked. But then people decided, well, if you need a little bit, a lot's better. And some of the guys would put on too much. And a sandy soil didn't need as much as the heavy soils like we had. And so it gets a bad reputation again. Well, that doesn't work. Uh, at any rate, here's how I learned about Dr. Albrecht was going and asking him those questions. And people say, well, how did you study under Dr. Albrecht? Because I didn't graduate from high school till 1961. He quit teaching classes in 1958. Well, it just turns out that he had a correspondence course back when nobody had correspondence courses. Well, he had it. I started studying under him, but then moved away from University of Missouri and actually finished up by correspondence. And it was a course that he taught privately. It was not sponsored by the university. So as a consequence, I have a certificate from him that says I'm an agronomist. But as far as as far as that, when he sent it, he sent a letter with it, and he said, "Now, Neal, you really aren't an agronomist." He said, "You've done the foundational work to become an agronomist. What makes you an agronomist is you go out in the field and start working with the farmers, and to the extent you use these basic principles and help the farmers, that's what's going to make you an agronomist." So that was I completed the course and met him in 1968, completed the course in 1973, and started to work with about three farmers the first year. And from 1973 to 1993, just about every farmer that was on the program was by referral from one to another. I could count on my two hands how many people I talked to, and they decided to do it. It was just one farmer telling another who told another. And that's how the business grew until 1993. And then in 93, my book Hands-On Agronomy came out, and then all of a sudden it exploded. So went all over the place. But
So,
until then,
I'm going to interrupt that story. It's beautiful. And I want to get an understanding of, I mean, we know what the free extension soil test looks like, but when you're looking at a soil test, I've seen them, I've utilized them. How many different minerals are you looking at, and what is, as opposed to the three
well,
before?
principally, we normally look at several things, even besides the minerals. But as far as the minerals themselves, in general, we look at 13 to 16, depending on what the problems may be.
Okay,
And so we measure those elements, and in addition, measure pH and humus content and the clay content of the soil. We have to know all that in order to evaluate whether we have enough of the various nutrients or not. And
got it.
all of those are expressed in pounds per acre. But then you look at the holding capacity of the soil, and each one of those is then looked at as to what percentage of that holding capacity it occupies. So, as Dr. Albrecht used to always say, we need to know how many pounds we have, and then we need to know how many pounds it takes to get to the proper percentage. Do we have too much or too little? And then you can calculate out exactly what you need from that. And there, let me just say right now, everything that we do is based on a formula. It is not, we look, oh, I guess you ought to do this, or I guess you ought to do that. The only guess is, or the only assumption is, that the soil test that's taken was done well enough to truly represent the needs of that soil. And what we tell people is if you've got a field that has a lot of differences in it, then you need to stay out of the different parts and just take the main portion of the field. Or if it's large enough to fertilize separately, sample it separately. And what you'll find is any kind of difference you can see in that field, the nutrient levels are going to be different and the needs are going to generally be different.
Got it. So broad area. Um, Talk to me about this. What are some of the most common, like just basic mistakes when people start working with you? What are the most common fertility mistakes that you see?
Grace, would you tell me that again?
I said, what are the most common fertility mistakes that you see farmers make when they're
The most
beginning to work
common.
with you?
Okay. Well, as far as I would say, the biggest mistakes that I see is not determining the lack of what we need. And the two things that most soils in the world, and we do work in 80 countries, and for all types of crops, and whatever you look at, there generally are two areas, and that is most of the heavy soils have far too much magnesium and not enough calcium. And almost every soil in the world has a deficiency in sulfur and a deficiency in boron. And those are the things that we see and have to work with most, simply because sulfur and boron will leach away like nitrates. Nitrates, sulfates, and borates leach away. So we have to keep an eye on those all the time. As far as I would say liming and sulfur and boron would turn out to be the things that we have to look at most, especially if it's a farm that has access to compost or manures, things like that, because we do need nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But in so many cases, that's not the limiting factors.
Okay, so even though those are there, you're finding those limiting factors are the boron and the sulfur more. Um,
Uh, they are, but if you don't take care of if you don't take care of if you have a lack of calcium and you don't take care of it, you have to have the calcium there to get the boron in. You have to have the calcium there to get the sulfur in. So if you put sulfur and boron on and still look at the pH and say, well, we got a good pH, so we're not going to put any calcium on, then the sulfur and boron doesn't work. Sometimes you get a response, sometimes you won't get much of a response at all.
Okay.
So it's a matter of getting everything to work together. And being that we're talking to the conservation department, I think there's something really important I should point out here, and that is Dr. William Albrecht started to work at University of Missouri in 1918, and he was hired as a soil microbiologist. That's what his specialty was. And when he first came there, the university had him begin working on, because nobody was doing it, had him working on the different types of rhizobium bacteria that was needed because each different legume needed a different rhizobium to grow properly. So he started working and isolating the rhizobium that was needed for clover and the ones that were needed for alfalfa and the ones that were needed for beans. And one of the big reasons was from that, I don't know how long before that, but at that time, the only state that had more cow-calf operations than the state of Missouri was Texas. Now, they might not have been as big in Missouri, but Missouri had more cow-calf operations all the way up until at least 3 or 4 years ago than any other state but Texas. So pasture and legumes and so forth back then was really a big thing. And so Dr. Albrecht started teaching the farmers how to use rhizobium bacteria. And the thing that they found was some farmers would put that on for their alfalfa and say, "Oh, this is the great. This is the answer. This is what I needed." And other farmers would put it on and say, "It didn't help me at all." And then there'd be some farmers that'd put it on an alfalfa field and they'd say, "Well, it worked on this part over here, but it didn't work on this part over here." And what he started to do, he said, "Well, I knew there had to be something more than just putting microbes on." So where did it work and where did it not work? That's when they started to use soil analysis to try to determine. And he actually worked this out based on using rhizobium bacteria on legumes. But then some of these guys were dairy farmers. When it came out of alfalfa or clover and they planted into corn silage, they said, you know what? My corn silage is better than it used to be. Well, rhizobium doesn't affect corn silage, but when you came in there and straightened out the nutrients, it helped for basically all the crops. And by the time he was finished getting his basis for getting the rhizobium to work, then the farmer would say, not only is it working for my legumes, but all my other crops are better as well. And I'll just mention this because you can check it out. There's a there's a research project that's going on at University of Missouri. It's been going on for 10 years. Randomized replicated research at Bradford Research Farm is being conducted by Tim Reinbott, who works for the Ag Research Service. And what they're
So,
doing is comparing the Albrecht system to other fertility systems to try to see, okay, which ones work the best. They're not just measuring yield, but Tim Reinbott says when you correct the soils according to the Albrecht system, he hasn't found another system that works better. But he said also the feed values are the highest, the microbial populations are the highest, and the carbon put back into the soil is the highest because they're checking all that. So it isn't just a matter of one thing, it's all that. Now, the reason I mentioned Tim Reinbott is because he has presentations that he makes all the time, and I would suggest that for the conservation department, that would be a good place to start if you want to look more into the science of the Albrecht
so
system.
I will interrupt you there to say, actually, next month we will have Tim Reinbott, and he's going to go into the science of this. So
Good, you love
we will do a follow up.
it.
Absolutely.
Okay,
And so
now
you mentioned
after
cow-calf operations. And so that brings me around to on this call, I know we have folks on here that run cattle farms and have plenty of forage. And I do know that we also have some row crop people on the call. Outside of that, if anybody wants to chime in, if they're not row crop or livestock, if anybody's doing perennial crops, fruiting, or market garden vegetable crops, feel free to drop that in the chat. But if you can speak to some of the key takeaways for somebody who is running livestock, whether it's a cow-calf operation or a direct market meat operation. What are some of the like key takeaways they can take? And maybe they're not running just alfalfa, but a mix of grasses and legumes.
When you look at crops in general, Dr. Albrecht made the statement, and I've seen it proven over and over. It doesn't matter whether you're growing blueberries or alfalfa or bananas or grass. The same basic mineral foundation is required first. In other words, that's the foundation upon which you build everything else. Now, after you get that foundation there, which the foundation is not as much for growing the crop as it is for feeding the root systems through the biology and so forth. And until you correct the soil structure, we don't get the right environment for the microbes. And this is what Dr. Albrecht found when he first started. What is it that most influences the environment for microbial populations? It's four elements: calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And the Resource Conservation District out of Colorado, I think it was, one of the fellows there several years ago published a series of articles for No-Till Journal. And in those articles, he was mentioning what each one of those nutrients do. And he said sodium, potassium, and magnesium, in terms of soil structure, all do the same things. But calcium does something completely different. He said, as far as when you start looking at a soil, when you put calcium on, it causes the clay particles to flocculate or aggregate together. And as they gather together, it increases the porosity of that soil. It increases more pore space. But he said when you put magnesium, potassium, or sodium on, they actually cause the opposite effect, and they cause the clay particles to spread out or disperse. And that actually stops up or reduces the pore space. And you can look at a soil where dairymen have put on so much manure that the potassium is 15 or 17% when it ought to be 7.5 or less. And when it rains on those areas, the water will stand on top. And you can have plenty of calcium, you can have everything else there, but if that potassium is excess, it stops up the pore space. Same thing with sodium, same thing with magnesium. So first thing we tell a client is if you want to look at the long-term assets in terms of your land, don't count limestone as a fertilizer, count limestone as a soil improvement. If the government would give grants to improve land and correct the limestone areas, we'd have so much more potential in terms of production. And I will just mention that for years and years and years, we received lots of samples from corn, which is a grass, but in recent years, we're almost receiving as many samples from pastures as we are from corn. And one of the big reasons is because, well, we when we look at soils and so forth, until Hands-On Agronomy came out in 1993, we got the most samples from Missouri. You'd expect that because that's where we live. But in about 1994 or 95, we started getting more samples from California than we did from Missouri. And California has been number one until 3 years ago, and Missouri number two. So Missouri dropped from number two to number three. And because New Zealand, which is, the little two islands in New Zealand, we receive more samples from New Zealand than we do from any state in the US in the last 2 years. That even beats out California. And you know what their basic thing is? Grass-fed dairy cattle. And they can see the difference so quickly in how fast that grass grows that just one tells another who tells another who tells another. And so uh, it's really grown. And people will say, oh, you don't need to fertilize pasture. Well, if you're just satisfied with what you got. But if you want to get the maximum out of it, pasture is just like anything else. You can improve the yields by quite a lot just by supplying the proper nutrients.
Awesome. It looks like we have a raised hand. Ethan, did you want to unmute and ask a question?
Not a question directly, but can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. mentioned earlier about lime programs with say USDA, but I do want to point out that in Missouri, the soil and water conservation districts do have a liming practice for pasture ground. So if that's something anyone is interested in or a resident, they can go to the conservation district at their local EA office and some of that.
That's
Perfect.
great to know. That's great to have because I still feel like probably if we look at everything, the lack of calcium in the soils is still the thing that if we learn what to put on, that would be doing the most to correct everything because getting that calcium level up, calcium is necessary to get everything else into the plant. So if we don't have enough calcium, it takes more fertilizer, it takes more uh, nutrients of all types in order to do that job. And to me, that is the best program that anyone could have to straighten out the land is to take care of the liming program the way it's needed. Thanks for
So
mentioning that.
I have a question too about Lyme, and this is something that I overheard at a field day recently in Kansas. I think it was Jack Geiger who was on this call, and it looks like he just jumped off. But there are different types of Lyme doing different things. Am I misremembering that, or can you speak to that?
That is really that is what everyone needs to consider, and that is most of the time liming is just looked at by pH and what does it require to correct the pH. But when you start looking at the nutrients that are needed, we've got two types of lime generally in the state of Missouri to consider, and that is calcitic lime or high calcium lime or calcium carbonate, all being the same, but they have different levels. And the other limestone is dolomite lime or dolomitic lime, which has, if textbook dolomite has twice as much calcium as magnesium, and if you put on a ton of dolomitic limestone, you should get the equivalent of 450 pounds of calcium and 225 pounds of magnesium if it's textbook. Now, it can vary, but the great thing is in the state of Missouri, if you go to the highway department, they have an analysis of basically every line from every quarry in the state of Missouri and how much calcium and how much magnesium it contains and how much you can get from it and so forth. And it's because every lime quarry wants to sell materials for making roads. Well, the transportation department wants to know, well, what are we buying? And some limes are half the half the value of others, and it depends on the contents and also how finely they're ground. If you get a really fine grind limestone, it's far more effective than a very coarse limestone. Now, both of them can have their place, but we actually advocate the use of, and I don't say that because I learned it, Dr. Albrecht taught us it. Michigan State University in the 1950s had a test, and Dr. Albrecht said, if you use this test and you do it the same way, you can tell how many pounds of calcium and magnesium you're going to get out of every ton of lime you apply. And so, first of all, we like to get the test from the queries, but sometimes they don't have the fineness of grind listed. And in those cases, then we can get a fineness of grind test on that. So uh, we ask people to send us a spec sheet on the limestone they're using. And if that spec sheet has everything we need to know, you can sit down and calculate it. If they don't know anything about the lime, we can do a test on it. But if they know where it comes from, that's a more accurate test than just one test at a time. So, yes, limestone matters. And what we'll find is in sandy soil, we'll wind up having to use quite a lot more dolomitic limestone, but in very heavy, medium to heavy soil, we'll wind up not often using dolomite. It's better to use calcitic limestone to raise that level. And you can calculate out what happens and monitor it as it goes. The thing about limestone is you don't get it all in 1 year. If you put on either one of those limestones, it's going to be 3 years before you see the full effects from it. And you can measure those year to year to year, or you can calculate what's going to happen year to year. And what happens is on a limestone, the calcium portion, you get 1/3 the first year, 1/3 the second year, 1/3 the third year. So it takes 3 years to get the full amount of calcium. But on the magnesium that's in that lime, whether it's dolomite or there could be some magnesium in calcium lime, You don't get any buildup the first year, and you get half the magnesium buildup the second year and the other half the third year. And again, you can monitor that on soil test if you're measuring each one and looking at the pounds that's there, and then using that to convert to the percentage of the amount of exchange capacity or holding capacity of that soil. And virtually on sands, we want 60% of that sand to be holding calcium. And on heavy clays, we want 68 to 70% to be holding calcium. And we have to then balance the magnesium out accordingly. It's all formulas, but the thing about it is most people don't want to do a formula. They want it easy. We just want to look at the pH and do it from there. Well, looking at that does better than not doing anything, but it doesn't give you the entire answer. And if you want to get the most out of your soils, if you want to grow nutrient dense foods like everyone's talking about, the best nutrient dense food would be whatever had the best feed value. And as Tim Reinbott at the University of Missouri is going to tell you, you correct what the Albrecht system has, and the feed value is always at the top. And I say that for us too.
That makes sense. We had a question come in. Can you talk about gypsum applications?
Gypsum applications. Yes, I'll. The important thing to know about gypsum is that you don't just use gypsum because you have a high pH. Uh, what we'll have in so many cases in the western part of the U.S., and we're going to be putting on a training program in Imperial, California in January, and we're going to go visit farms that have pHs in the eights, and they're going organic and some conventional, some growers are conventional, some are organic, but they're actually growing successful crops in high pH soils because what you do is look at what it is that's missing and supply those in the proper amounts. And even on high pH soil, you can build the levels as to what is needed. So when we start looking at gypsum, the first thing we'll find in a lot of those high sodium soils is they're applying 1, 2, 3 tons of gypsum, sometimes more, and it gets worse instead of better. Gypsum is a great material and it works when you use it properly. But on the test that Dr. Albrecht did, until the calcium gets to 60%, gypsum, even though it has sulfur in it, and it has calcium in it, when you put gypsum on a low calcium soil, the sulfur in that gypsum will actually pull more calcium out. And so, in terms of the use of gypsum, what we'd say always is don't look at your pH, look at your percentage of calcium. And if the calcium percentage is 60% or higher, then you can put on as much as a ton of gypsum per year and get good response from it. But sometimes it will take 3 or 4 years of that before you get the proper corrections from it. And then a farmer will say, well, if it's going to take 2 years, why can't I put on 2 tons the first year? If you put 2 tons on, that's instead of 350 pounds of sulfur or 335, depending on which one you're looking at. But instead of 335, let's use the low number, that's 670 pounds of sulfur. When you put that on a soil, it's going to suck a bunch of calcium out because the crops are not going to use it, and the microbes are not going to use it. And in general, if a soil is open enough for the water to move through, all that sulfur is going to be gone in 12 months, and it's going to take something with it when it leaves. So what we'll tell the client is and it's what Dr. Albrecht always taught, never apply more than 1 ton of gypsum per year. If you have a true gypsum, I had a client in California, they were getting ready to plant 3,000 acres of grapes. He came to a meeting and I said that, and he said, Neal, we don't get the best response from 1 ton. We get the best response from 3 tons of gypsum. He said, when we put on 3 tons, we always get the best response. Well, we analyzed his gypsum, and it took 3 tons to be equal to 1 ton of real true gypsum. He was getting, he was putting on 3 tons, but it was 3 tons that only had a third of the amount. So it took 3 tons to be equivalent to 1 ton of actual gypsum. Now, if you put gypsum on soil that are too low in calcium, it's going to hurt you instead of help you. And we never solve the problem, even on those high sodium soils in Arizona and California and other parts of the world. We never solve the problem of salting out until we make sure the calcium is above 60%. Then you can start using gypsum and it'll work great. But otherwise, if you're using gypsum and it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse, gypsum's not the thing we should be using yet. We need to correct the calcium first and then put on the gypsum. And this is something that until you look at the nutrient holding capacity of a soil, which is the clay content and the humus content, until you look at that, have no idea how much we need in a soil. But once we look at that and measure the clay and the humus are the two parts, they have a negative charge and they attract positively charged ions like calcium. And once you have enough negatives there, well, the question is, all right, we want 60 to 70% of those negatives to have calcium attached. If we don't have 60%, gypsum is a not just a poor choice, it's a very bad choice for using on a soil.
And so when somebody gets their soil test with you, you're going to make recommendations whether they're looking at gypsum, lime, or something else, correct?
When a soil test is sent to us, we do the test and recommendations. That's all included in the price. And what we'll do is take a look at that soil and use the formulas, which basically the only real hard formulas to work out are the formulas for calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium. And the hardest one's magnesium. But the all of these are simple. I tell people you don't need to be a mathematician. All you need to do is understand arithmetic. If you can add, subtract, multiply, and divide, you can work out what needs to be done with the soil test. It's just a matter of learning the principles that are involved. And it takes, to learn about how to use calcium, it takes about 3 days. The other thing is to learn about how to use calcium and magnesium on the sand, it takes about 6 days. But it's just a matter of once you learn what the parameters are, you can work out any problem. And for the first 5 years after I finished the study course of Dr. Albrecht, he told me when I finished it, now, Neal, you're only going to get problem soils. Nobody's going to send you good soils. I said, well, why do you say that? He said, because if you don't have a problem, he said, the university does soil tests for free. Who's going to pay you to do a test unless what they're doing is not working? Well, for the first 5 years, basically the soils that we saw were problems and problems and problems, and some of them some tough problems. But you could work those out. And after that fight, I used to feel, when I first started, feel sorry for myself. When am I ever going to get to work with some good soils? That was the best thing that could ever happen, because when you find out you can solve the problem for those problem soils, then you know good and well once I put these principles in operation for a good soil, it's just, if there's something that's missing, it's just going to make it better. It just takes longer to see it. The problem soil you can see pretty quick.
Yeah, that's true. Question, so we talked about grazing and the just setting that baseline for the nutrients of all plants. When you're working with, so we do have folks on who are working with perennial crops, whether that's berries or fruit trees. Is
Mhm.
there anything different in how you work with perennial crops versus forage or row crop?
There are, for various crops, there are different things to consider. But I think one of the most extraordinary examples that I can use is Hands-On Agronomy, the book that I wrote about just what I understood about soil. It came out in 93. And in 94, I had an opportunity to speak to 24 berry growers out in California. And one of the fellows, after the meeting was over, came and said, Neal, I grow 200 acres of raspberries. And he said, and this was 94. The reason they had me come and speak is because as of then, in 2002, they were going to lose all of their materials that they use to sterilize soil. So they're going to lose all the soil sterilants. And these guys were already trying to do experiments, see, well, when we lose these, how much yield are we going to lose? And so he came to me and he said, now, I've already done the experiments. And he said, if we don't use soil sterilants, I lose 15,000 pounds of berries to the acre, and I can't afford to grow berries if we have to do that. But he said, you have told that if we send you soil samples, if we have one field that does better than the others, that the samples ought to tell it. And he said, I've got one field that raises double what all the textbooks say you can raise in terms of raspberry. I make twice as much as that. And he said, I'm going to send those in with the other samples on 200 acres of raspberries and see if you can pick it out. Well, he sent 35 samples off 200 acres. And I still remember the one that it was. He only sent one from that farm, but it was sample number 15. And I called him on the phone and said, it's sample number 15. And he was quiet for a minute and he said, chills are going up and down my back. He said, that's the only sample I sent you from that field. And you said, that's it. And that, he said, he hadn't even seen the samples yet. And I said, when you see them, that matches up what Dr. Albrecht says is the ideal soils. And his experiment, all those guys did experiments, but they didn't put the good soil in. They took the worst soil they had. Well, when he did experiments to leave off his soil stimulants on that best soil, he didn't lose the yield at all. And he said, I can go from conventional to organic now. And from then until now, he's raised between 170 and 200 acres of certified organic raspberries. And he said, all we have to do is straighten out the soil. Well, that was for the first 5 or 6 years. And then he got some soils because a lot of it's leased. He got some soils from an old apple orchard. And in that apple orchard, the copper levels, everything else he straightened out, but the copper level were 3 times higher than anything that we'd seen up to that point. And he called and said, Neal, in these soils on this old apple orchard, when the soil copper levels are between 12 and 15, an ideal up to then was called 2 to 5, 2 on wheat, 5 on soybeans. But he said when we get when these soils between 12 and 15, we don't get any rust on our raspberries, and we can even pick in a drizzle and still don't have rust on our berries. So in terms of berries, what we find is any crop that is super sensitive, once you correct the foundation, which is what Dr. Albrecht would always say is the ideal for biological activity in the soil, and that's what he was always looking for. He was looking, what do we use to correct the physical structure, which would be chemistry, to correct the physics, to benefit the biology, because that was his goal all the time. How do we get the most life back into the soil? And what we found there was once that foundation was there and we corrected everything else to at least the minimum, better to get to the low side of excellent, which is defined as well. But once they got that, what he would say is the first thing we do is correct that copper, because that then takes care of one of the biggest problems they had, which was rust in their raspberries. And we find that any very perishable, and I use the same on blackberries, same on strawberries, but we don't have to get it that high in a lot of other crops. But the more perishable they are, seems like the more the copper makes that much difference. And when you start reading up on what micronutrients do, the two things that fight rust and fungus diseases most in plants is copper and boron. Boron being one of them that we have to work on all the time. Now, one thing about copper, once you get that copper to where it needs to be, it's going to be probably decades. So far, we've got people that got the copper up in the 1970s to where it needed to be, and they haven't had to do anything again. Here it is 50 years later. But you measure the copper, and if it starts to get down below 2, then you need to do something, or below 5 if you're in soybean, you need to do something about it. Most soils have less than 2 parts per million copper, and 2 parts per million is the absolute minimum that every plant needs in order to fight rust and fungus diseases.
Do you ever, I'm curious, so there are people who use copper as a fungicide spray, foliar. Do you ever see too much copper in the soil?
Actually, the copper that we recommend, if you put it on dry, it's not too much. But if you put it on as a liquid, just a little bit of liquid, if you cover the soil with liquid, it's going to kill the microbes. Every place it touches, it's going to kill them. In the Netherlands 2 years ago, they did some experiments to see, well, what happens when we use copper? And what they found is when they tried to apply copper as a liquid, it killed the life in the soil. But when they put it on as a dry material, then they said we started to study what was happening because the microbes stayed alive. And what they found was those microbes, because it's when you put the amount of copper we're talking about on, it's a little stone here and a little stone there. But those microbes start to work on it. They said the microbes actually convert it into a form that is harmless to the microbial population. And so what we tell our clients is if you're going to spray a foliar copper, don't use copper sulfate, which is what you use to kill algae in the soils and so on and so forth. Use copper chelate. Use copper chelate as a foliar. But if you're going to put the copper chelate is so expensive, it'll never build the copper in your soil. You just won't spend that much money. But the copper sulfate, we can use dry and broadcast it and build the levels up in the soil without killing the microbial populations in that soil.
That's fascinating.
If you put now, if you put dry copper into water, like the rice growers do in California, I mean, they're putting dry copper sulfate, but it goes into the water. Well, that's enough to kill the algae and everything else, because that's one of the things they use it for is algae control. But when you put it on dry land, now it doesn't spread out so quickly. It spreads very slowly, and as a consequence, we don't suffer the same results.
So another question, we've talked a bit about bacteria in the soil. At any point, are you measuring bacteria? And then my follow-up question to that is, do you find that farmers need to utilize the liquid microbiome inoculants to reintroduce this, or is it enough to just balance the soil and then the biology comes back?
All right, that's a really good question, and let let me be sure I start at the basis of this because we have clients who use microbial products and get great results, and others who use them and don't get results at all under looks like the same circumstances. We have other clients who don't use microbials at all, but they use biological stimulants, which is all the enzymes and so on and so forth. No live uh, microbes in there, and in many cases they'll get a response. In many other cases they'll not get a response. So what's the difference? Why does it work or not? What we find is the better shape the soil is in, the better biological stimulants work. And if you put on the microbial stimulant, they actually do more for good soil than they do for poor ones. Because in so many cases in the poor soils, there's some big something that's limiting it. And until you correct that, it's more of a limiting factor than the life of the soil. Uh, when I say that, if we have an extreme excess of sodium, if we don't get that sodium corrected, we can put on biological stimulants and so on and so forth, but we're not going to get the same response. So the clients, we have a number of clients that use materials to stimulate microbes all the way from fish emulsion to biological stimulants and to specific microbials. Now, we don't advise on microbial stimulants. You got to get a microbiologist or someone that understands. I don't know how to do that. But in terms of measuring biology, no, we don't. We measure in the soil tests that we use, we'll actually measure the humus content and then we'll measure the nutrient levels. But we don't have the equipment and so forth to do the proper measurements for life in the soil. Now, I know there are certain tests that people use, but Tim Reinbot has all the instrumentation, and he's the one who, after correcting the soils, actually you'll probably see this in his presentation. He'll have charts up there to show, well, here's how much here's the amount of bacteria and the amount of fungi and the amount of various things in those soils. And what he'll tell you is that the life of the soil, the populations of soil life are the highest where you get the soils corrected according to what Dr. Albrecht would say is the ideal soil. Why is that? Because the ideal soil is not looking at how many bushels can we grow. The ideal soil is looking at getting the right amount of aeration and the right amount of moisture in the soil in order to grow the crops. And then if we put the nutrients on, it will do its best. And this is what we find time after time. The microbial populations don't thrive until we build the right environment for them. And it just so happens when you get the right balance of calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium, that's the main influence on pore space. When we get that pore space there, about 50% of the pore space will be air and 50% will be taken up by water. Now you get a flood, that's going to change, but it'll come back quicker if you've got the right nutrients there. It'll actually recorrect itself. Same thing with drought. I mean, we'll have clients that say, "We have drought, but we don't suffer the consequences." I was on a large client's farm in Washington State 2 weeks ago. They get 8 inches of rainfall a year. They do drip irrigation. When I first started working with them, almost 18, 19 years ago, almost 20 years, the advice was you need to go cover crops, keep your ground covered. It gets so hot and so forth. We can't go cover crop. We only get 8 inches of rain. Today, with the same amount of rainfall and still drip irrigation, the middles are covered with cover crops, and they will raise 2 cover crops a year on the same amount of rainfall they got before. It is not a matter of that you have to have 20 inches or 40 inches of rain. It's a matter of you have to utilize what you've got. And once they corrected those soils, now and not only that, their humus content when we started was less than 2, basically 1.8, 1.9. Over the years, they've been measuring, and this is on about 3,000 acres. Over the years, they've been measuring every block because they take samples every year from all the various blocks that they're growing. And they keep up with this on the computer, including the humus content. Today, they have many of those soils in the 4% and some bumping 5%. Only thing they've changed is a matter of getting the nutrients right, and now all of a sudden the plants can utilize the moisture better. And he said, Neal, this now, what do? They put all the materials on, but they have for about the last 15 years, the soil was in shape enough that we told them you need to find a good biological stimulant and use on there to stimulate biological activity. And they do that religiously every year. You don't just straighten out the soil and then stop. You got to do something to stimulate the microbes and supply what they need.
Beautiful. For just a moment, I want to remind everyone, drop questions in the chat. I know many of you are farmers yourselves, researchers. I'm sure that so far this conversation has sparked some questions about how you can utilize this on your farm. And I do have a question as well. With vegetables, those tend to be, rather than perennial annual, they're oftentimes quick turn crops where you're going to plant several plantings within one season. I think radishes, lettuces, what have you. Are there any crops that are more sensitive to soil balancing that you would say, if you're growing this crop, make sure you're balancing your soils? Or the other piece of that would be, many of these vegetable growers rotate constantly. How do you recommend they utilize the soil test? Once a year, every other?
Well, for the most part, we'd say if you're going, and we have clients who will go baby greens, for example, and they'll go several crops a year of different greens on the same soils. And what we'll do is go in and analyze those soils and put the nutrients on in it. And when you're raising baby greens, you take nutrients out, but you don't take huge amounts out. So as a consequence, well, all you have to do is monitor that soil. And in general, if you supply what's needed on the soil, there's enough. If you supply what's needed to get to the low side of excellent, and that, people, well, how do you know that? Well, I don't know it, but all I had to do was learn what Dr. Albrecht had learned over the years, and he'd say that for this nutrient, here's the minimum you need. This is the low side of excellent. This is the high side of excellent. This is too much. This is too little. And we've used that. And what I would say is, if I have someone that's growing a seed crop, well, then we advise that they sample before every one, as long as they're making enough money off it. But if you're growing rotating vegetables and going to get 2 or 3 crops a year off, or maybe more of those little baby green. But as a general rule, start monitoring at least once a year. And if you start seeing you're losing ground, then you may want to take a sample, after 1 or 2 crops or whatever. But uh, that's the key. Here's what we tell people: if you see that you're putting on fertility or fertilizer or nutrients or whatever, and the levels keep going down, you're not using enough. But on the other hand, if you put on nutrients and the levels start going up, then someplace along the way you're going to need to cut back, or else you're going to get to the point where you got too much. Now, what difference does that make? When phosphorus gets too high, it starts tying up zinc. And most people, well, what difference does that make? Well, it's not just nutritional. We have to have enough zinc in the soil because zinc is necessary for moisture absorption into the plant. You have to have enough potassium first, but then if you don't have enough zinc, we have turfgrass people that, I mean, when they take the turfgrass up, they're taking just, the very shallow soil right along with the roots. That's where the most of the phosphorus and zinc availability is in the soil. And turfgrass, so many times, their big limiting factor, they'll put the phosphate back, but they don't know to put the zinc back. And we'll have turfgrass people who say, well, the grass is here and we water it, and in 3 days the ground's still wet, but the grass is already shriveling up. We can't get enough water into it. As soon as you put enough zinc on there, I mean, it'll correct it in 3 to 5 days. As soon as you put the amount of zinc on there that isn't required, all of a sudden those grass, that turf grass, just start pulling that water in, and it solves it that quickly. If zinc's the only problem you have. Now, uh, if you don't have enough potassium there, then you got to get the potassium right. But now here's the real thing on greens and tees on golf courses. We're looking at turf grass, and we'll have a golf course manager that'll say, "Oh, our greens and tees can't stand the traffic. We just got too many people playing golf here." Well, when you analyze many of those, because of the way it leaches away and so forth, we find out, well, you don't have enough potassium, and or you don't have enough manganese, and or you don't have enough zinc. So they start putting on potassium, and they put on the manganese and zinc. And manganese and zinc, you once you get there, you just stop. But after a while, they keep on putting on potassium, and if they're not checking, the potassium level gets above 10%, or the potassium and sodium together above 10% of the saturation, and that blocks out the manganese, and it makes the grass weaker. And they think, oh, we need more potassium, and they pour on more potassium, and it just gets worse because they're blocking manganese uptake. And the key to stalk strength is first potassium, second manganese, third copper. And potassium blocks out manganese once it gets above 10% in the soil. So these guys, they're having an opposite problem. It looks like they're needing more when actually they put on too much. And you can have excellent manganese there and it just doesn't get in. So you don't want too much. Anytime you have too much of one thing, it's going to affect something else. And potassium, even before it affects zinc, before it affects manganese, the potassium level, once it gets above 7.5%, actually start tying up boron. And what does boron do for a plant? Well, boron's necessary to get the calcium into the plant. Boron takes the starch out of the leaf and puts it in the fruit or the grain. Boron is necessary from start to finish to get the nitrogen to work properly. If we put on too much potassium and then cause a boron to be tied up, it actually inhibits our nitrogen utilization, inhibits how big the size of the seed or the berry is going to be. So all these things, it really is truly a balance between elements, and you can measure them and see them on the test and know when to stop or what you need to do in order to try to solve a problem. And uh, this is, to me, this is the main key, and that is know when to stop and know when you get too low, because getting too low is going to be harder on you than generally than having too much.
Beautiful. Too much of a good thing is definitely a reality. Um, at this point, personally, I have no more questions. If anybody on the call would like to unmute and ask a question, feel free. I'm more than happy to entertain that. We have a few minutes. if anybody has
While
learned
they're looking
anything.
at a question, there's a thought that came to mind that I'd like to mention to everyone. And that is, Dr. Albrecht used to always say, once you have the soil corrected, he would say, take a soil that's so toxic that nothing will grow in it, nothing, and just correct the aerobic zone. That's as deep as a fence post rots, just about generally 6 to 8 inches. Just correct the nutrients in that level. Don't worry about what's down below. And he said, once you get those nutrients corrected, you can plant plants in that soil. They will grow and send their taproot right through that so-called toxic subsoil without any observable adverse effects. What he's saying is the aerobic zone is where the microbial activity is most, and really the top 2 inches is the biggest portion. And the top 5 inches, 95% of the humus is formed in the top 5 inches and 70% in the top 2 inches. So the aeration at the top is extremely important, but also to get the nutrients right so you're feeding the organism properly. But we've actually done that. We've taken soil that would grow nothing and correct the top 6 inches or so. And the one example I use is sweet basil in a greenhouse in California. They planted, they grew sweet basil there, and then finally it all died. And they tried to plant it, and it died again, and it died again. Well, they said, we'll just take out the soil and put new soil in. Instead of doing that, we were working with them in their potting soil to balance out their potting soils. And they had potting soil that were 3 years old, that all the effects from the lime and everything else was already showing up. And I said, you've got that balanced potting soil. Just take old big plastic tubing and cut about 6 to 8 inches of that, fill it up with your potting soil, plant your sweet basil in that. Instead of moving the soil out, that's what they did. That basil grew down through, sent its roots right through that so-called toxic subsoil. And not only that, they said, no, it isn't as good as it was before. It's better. They said, we have higher tonnage, we have sweeter taste, we have bigger plants just by correcting that aerobic zone.
Perfect. In the chat, Jack says thoughts on P is getting high, BS levels in good range.
Well, it depends on which soil test you're using as to what the good range is. And we still, on the test that we use, we still measure P2O5, phosphate, not elemental P, which that basically everybody's looking at P2O5. That's the form the plant's going to use. But in many soil tests, it's expressed as elemental P. And then the further confusion becomes that is it in pounds per acre or is it in parts per million? So if you take the test that we do and it's P2O5, whatever that number is, if you want elemental P, we divide it by 2.1. All right. And then once you do that, and all of a sudden I'm doubting whether it's 2.1 or 2.3, but anyhow, it's that's, I'm pretty sure 2.1. And then if you want parts per million, divide that by 2 again. So it depends on which one of those numbers you're looking at as to where we'd say you need to be. But in terms of P2O5, what we would tell you is P2O5 on the test that we're looking at, it depends on whether it's a light sandy soil or whether it's a heavy, heavy clay. Because the phosphate, the lighter sands don't need as much phosphate before they get oversaturated. So on sands, we'll say generally a minimum of 250 pounds per acre of P2O5. Divide that by 2.3 to get elemental P, divide that by 2 to get parts per million. The high side in terms of, well, that's absolute minimum. The If you want to start looking at soils and say, well, what's a good average? About 350. But on medium to heavy soils, the phosphate can be pushed up to 750 before it goes above excess. Now, why does that matter? Because so many people use compost and manures, and compost and manure will build your phosphate levels by more than the amount you have in them. Because when you put that on the soil, it stimulates microbial activity, and the microbes in that soil will actually increase the phosphorus by more than the amount you're putting on and still grow the crop. And so after 3 or 4 years of compost utilization, we'll start to see phosphate level begin to go up. Sometimes they creep up, sometimes they go up quickly. But once it gets to 750, we say, okay, you need to stop. And especially if your zinc level hasn't been matched to it, because just barely having enough zinc, that can cause a problem in terms of moisture absorption and so forth. Now, saying all that, I would say that of all the excesses I work with, if I had to have something that was excess, I'd rather it be phosphate. But if you do have an excess of phosphate, the only way we know to get it out is to grow it out. I don't know anything you can do to take available phosphate down other than growing a crop that would take it out. One of the most effective at that is growing high tonnages of alfalfa. They'll pull that phosphate down. You can have an extreme excess, and then 5 years of good alfalfa cropping, you can get it back down. And that's because the alfalfa sends its roots down below that excess and can get what it needs out of the subsoils. That's at least that's one reason. Now, in terms of phosphate, there are so many different types of phosphate tests. And what I'll tell you is look for a phosphate test that when you put on manure or compost, the P2O5, if you put on more than what it takes to grow the crop, the P2O5 bills, well, that's one test. But we work with about two thirds of our clients are some type of conventional grower, and about one-third of our clients are some type of natural or organic. And the phosphate test that shows up in terms of Dr. Albrecht's test is people that are natural or organic that use soft rock phosphate or hard rock phosphate. On almost every phosphate test that you look at in the world, when you put a hard or soft rock phosphate on, it looks like you didn't put any phosphate on because they're not measuring root acid soluble available phosphate, they're measuring water soluble phosphate. That sells a lot of phosphate if all you measure is water soluble. But Dr. Albrecht would always say, it's not just water soluble, it's what the exudates of the plant puts out that enables that plant to take up so-called insoluble, but yet it's available because of the exudates from the plants. And he said, this is the kind of phosphate we need to know. If you're using hard or soft rock phosphate and you put on 500 pounds to the acre and you have a phosphate test that really measures phosphorus, it will show in about 12 months, at least wait 12 months, and from 12 months on, it will show that that phosphate level will come up in the soil by about 100 pounds of P2O5 per acre, which is exactly what is supposed to happen. But most phosphate samples will show you nothing happen. It sells a whole lot more phosphate, but what we want to know is how much phosphate is there that the plant can get. And there are very few phosphate tests in the world that do that.
Awesome. Thanks for answering that question. We have just a few more minutes left. If anybody else does have a question, I will read it. But in this time, first of all, Neal, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day today. Conversations with you are always fascinating.